Welcome, everyone. This is Linda Nelson, president of ICOR, and we are really happy today to have Oliver Schmidt with us as a guest speaker. Oliver is the president and CEO of C4CS, an international management consultancy headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He has more than 25 years of consulting, training, and executive coaching experience in the areas of crisis management, organizational leadership, and strategic communication. A multilingual executive who has lived and worked in North America, Europe, and Asia. Oliver routinely advises senior leaders, including the CEOs and members of the board of directors of publicly listed and privately held corporations regarding high-stakes business issues. His consulting work focuses on providing guidance to domestic and international client partners in the areas of issues and stakeholder management, reputation and crisis management, and crisis and risk communication. Oliver has addressed professional audience in several dozen countries. The author of numerous peer-reviewed articles about a range of crisis management, strategic communication, and leadership topics. He's also conducted interviews with various domestic and international industry and mainstream media, and taught as a guest professor at leading universities in multiple countries. We are really happy to have Oliver with us again today. He has also spoken earlier this year with us. Just a couple of logistics before I hand it over to him. Number one, we will send you the link to this recording probably by Friday, maybe Monday. In order to get a certificate of attendance, you need to attend at least 35 minutes. We will be taking questions at the end, but please feel free to post your questions anytime using the questions button. And Oliver has provided a handout. So there's a little handout arrow there. You can download it right from this presentation, and we'll provide it as well when we send out your certificates. So with no further ado, welcome, Oliver, and we look forward to your presentation today.
Thank you very much, Linda. Appreciate the introduction. Let me just point out real quick that the handout, which is available for download, mirrors exactly the slides that I will be showing today. So for those who would like to have the deck of slides available as a handout at any time during the presentation, that is downloadable. That said, welcome everyone. Effective scenario-based crisis communication training, a topic that's dear to me. I began conducting crisis communication training about
Oliver, we just lost your audio. You just went on mute. He's been doing crisis communication for training for so long, it's left him speechless.
Yeah.
There you go. You're back again.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope so. I was just saying that I've been doing crisis communication training for 25 years. It's not dramatically different what we're doing today, but certainly has changed over the years. As Linda pointed out, we do have a Q&A set aside at the end of the session today. I might be speaking for about 45 minutes or so, and then we will segue into the participant questions. As Linda mentioned earlier, if you want to ask questions, you may also use the chat function, but they will be addressed primarily at the end of the session today. I have included two participant polls. I believe it's slide 15 and then another one toward the end of the deck, and would love to receive everyone's input. I think it'll be interesting for the audience members to understand what attendees across the board are thinking, where they are in the planning process and so forth. That's what those participant polls are geared toward, and I look forward to bringing those up later. In addition to the welcome, I wanted to, of course, show you the agenda at the beginning of the deck, the presentation. I typically, including for presentations that I make for ICOR and those who are interested in the topics that I stand for, have fundamentals as an agenda item that introduces the topic, but also the areas of expertise and how I see them, how my company C4CS sees them. And following that introductory fundamentals component of the presentation today, We will have the first of the two audience polls. And then we're going to talk specifically about crisis communication training parameters and social media as a standalone training component, which is very important. Otherwise, it wouldn't appear separate on the agenda. And then we're closing out today by sort of reviewing the most important items under what you need, and then the Q&A that I mentioned earlier. Again, maybe 10, 15 minutes. Not sure yet how quickly we will get through the slides, but I very much look forward and hope that there will be questions for me, and that there will be a little bit of back and forth toward the end of the presentation today. All right, then let's jump right in. Crisis defined under, again, fundamentals, as I just said, any adversity that severely disrupts business and causes damage to stakeholder trust, reputation, and the bottom line. And I fully realize that the definition for crisis that the organizations represented here today, as far as its attendees are concerned, may be very different. That's a definition, very broad, obviously, that has worked very well for my company, which was formed in the 1990s, and we have used this definition pretty much throughout. Now that we have that set aside, I do want to let you know that at C4CS, and I personally, we view crisis as something that's really not only to do with danger, but also with opportunity. Here's a Chinese symbol for crisis, composed of two characters. One represents danger, and the other not exactly opportunity, more the chances that are tied to the dangers. But let's just go with danger and opportunity for the sake of getting this concept across. Also under fundamentals, I like to remind everyone that in today's world, it's really not a question of if or whether an organization will have a crisis unfolding. It's much more a matter of what type of crisis will occur, how it will happen, when it will happen, what form it will take, and so forth. That goes back to Ian Mitroff, University of Southern California. Very true still. He said that many years ago, and I say it myself, but like to quote Ian when it comes to my presentations. Then we need to take a quick look at the crisis management process, because I want to make it very clear today that while crisis communication is critical when it comes to overcoming crises, responding effectively to crisis incidents in the corporate world, organizational leadership world, and so forth. However, communication is really just one piece of the puzzle within a much broader crisis management realm, if you will. And therefore, it's important to look at the crisis management process, which, again, I talk about this toward the beginning of my presentation, consists of pre-crisis phase, crisis phase, and post-crisis phase. And the response that we heavily usually focus on, which I will talk about today as well, to a degree at least, is really just what we have here as the crisis phase. In order to do a good job doing that response phase, what we need to do is do a very good job doing the pre-crisis phase, and then obviously also following a crisis where we have recovery, evaluation, learning, and change on our to-do list. But we're focusing today, and that's why this appears in italics, on the preparation as part of the pre-crisis phase. And I say in parentheses, that includes training, very importantly. And the organizations represented here today may have all different kinds of crisis-related training. There's certainly, I would think at least, tabletop crisis exercises. Then you might have semi-live and live exercises running, drills, whatever terminology you might use. But I'm interested in discussing today how communication fits into all of this, because it's an integral part of that preparation process and must be included. We're currently, as C4CS, getting ready to provide a pretty comprehensive tabletop crisis exercise for a global manufacturing company, which will have several index regarding communication challenges. But it's very different from a crisis communication training where we really focus much more heavily on communication skills, getting spokespersons ready, and a little more about this, obviously, in just a bit. So, already said it, communication is indeed critical when it comes to crisis response. In our world, it's really about bringing together the three areas that are identified on this slide. Now, in the summer, about 2 months ago or so, we published an ebook on crisis management of C4CS, and that is actually a graphic that's included there. The three areas are, first of all, managerial response, which is essentially the decision making that goes into crisis response. You have to, once you are tasked with responding to a crisis, make critical decisions, usually very quickly based on limited information and so forth. That's the managerial response. Following the decision making, you need to have activities in order to rectify the situation, in order to mitigate, control the crisis, contain, and so forth. And that would be the operational response. But in order for those two to work together smoothly, you need to have communication. And that needs to be communication on the internal end and on the external end. In other words, there are internal stakeholders, and many of the people on this webinar today will certainly know about this. I'm assuming that they are at least close to corporate communication in terms of the functional area within the organization they work for. And obviously then there is, in addition to internal audiences or stakeholders, as I usually say, which is primarily employees, the external stakeholders. And that may be anything from your clients or customers to regulatory agencies, law enforcement, it would be your vendors and so forth. But very importantly, this is what we use. The response has to go hand in hand as far as these three areas are concerned. And it's very important to keep in mind that communication is critical, but communication alone is never, ever going to fix things. I've a lot of PR consultants out there who sometimes unfortunately claim that they can fix everything. That is not the case. We do need to have the managerial decision making, the operational response, the crisis response related activities, because if I have malfunctioning brakes, I can't communicate that away. I actually have to fix the brake. Okay, and let's take a look at important questions that need to be asked during a crisis as we're getting ready to communicate. And obviously, we're now in the thick of it as far as the communication piece is concerned. And this goes back to, I don't know if people have heard of the Leswell formula or other things, if some of the members in the audience maybe studied communication science over many years ago in college. Anyhow, this goes to the sort of the foundation of communication. What is the desired result of the planned communication? And for those who might now say, well, duh, why would we even have to think about this? In my practice and my experience in the last close to 30 years, it's critically important to actually understand what my objective is. And furthermore, to understand what the message is going to be, what I want to communicate, who the recipient of that information is, who will be the sender, which is 3. Those are questions that we definitely need to ask. Here is the recipient under 4, and I put two-way in parentheses because, and I've been advocating this for many, many years, communication should indeed, in a crisis situation, always be two-way, not a one-way street. You're not just there with your megaphone letting people know X or Y or Z, and then they don't have any feedback option. That's not how it works. You have stakeholders these days that actually demand feedback option, and therefore two-way is critical in terms of the efficacy of any type of communication during a crisis. That's not to say that it's not also very important to have one-way communication available. For instance, when we're talking about notification in the case of a crisis, or some other elements where the one-way street is still sufficient. But by and large, when it involves stakeholders, go the two-way route. Yeah? Then we have 5 and 6. How and or where will the crisis communication happen? That points to the channel, tool, or venue. Under 6, we obviously need to have a timeline attached to this. And again, people might say, well, what's this all about, Oliver? These things are critical. I actually go through them question by question with very senior people, including the CEOs of large companies, and ask them, what are we looking at here? When are you going to potentially appear on the scene? Because you might have to address based on the scope, magnitude of what's happening of whatever stakeholder group, and that all needs to be mapped out. Off the cuff doesn't really work very well there. And you do need to have your ducks in a row, and planning is critical. So then let's also take a quick look at the evaluation. In order to evaluate, this is very different for crisis communication. You not only have to evaluate post-crisis, which is typical for any communication campaign that you might run, where you're sitting down after everything is done. All right, how did we do? What are the statistics and so forth? Very different with crisis communication. Not only do we need to do this after the fact in doing the so-called post-crisis phase, as mentioned earlier, we also need to do it, and that's critical, during the actual crisis, pretty much in real time, where we have to look at, did we do well, did we not well? And this is now the tie-in when it comes to the crisis, communication training, because all of these things need to be trained. And in order to do just that, we need to have everyone in that training room and work as a unit in order to understand what teamwork is all about and how it can be applied toward the communication needs during a crisis. Before I go into the crisis communication training parameters, I also wanted to show you this slide, crisis communication tenets. Those can also be found in the materials that my company puts out, website, and so forth. Crisis communication does have to be timely, truthful, consistent, and coordinated. And I'll be very glad to talk about this more, perhaps during the Q&A, if there are additional questions. Obviously, any crisis communication training should discuss these items. The fact that it has to be timely, truthful, consistent, and coordinated. We're going to be shedding a little more light on as we go along with the slides. But for now, it's probably good to move over into crisis communication training parameters, and then revisit the tenets at a later time. However, before we do so, I almost forgot, we actually have care to share on our agenda, and I would ask Linda to, as I'm moving ahead, help me sort of assess where the audience members are in terms of their planning, their organizations. So we have these four areas here. Does your organization offer recurring scenario-based crisis communication training? And I will certainly address under crisis communication training parameters and what needs to be done in order to be successful as far as the training itself is concerned, why we're talking about recurring training, as in it can't just happen once every blue moon. It has to be, there has to be a regularity to it. And then it needs to be, should indeed be scenario based. We're going to talk about this later too. But for starters now, I see that
about 5 more seconds. So if you
okay,
could get your
that the
votes
poll
in,
is
and then
open.
we'll share.
Yeah, if you could please put down whether currently you just don't have any crisis communication training, that would be one. Your company offers that type of training, but it's not scenario based, or it's offered, doesn't happen regularly though. And then 4, which would be the ideal from where I sit. There is that type of training in place. It is in fact scenario based, and it's done at least once a year. And in terms of frequency, I can certainly address that as well, because we certainly also have worked with a number of clients that have done trainings more often than just once a year.
Okay, so Oliver, we're
yes,
sharing
thank
the
you, Linda.
poll results, and 29% do not have any training, but 42% do have training but not regular. And then we have 17% and 13% saying that the managers get it, or that they do training but it's not scenario based.
Okay, that's roughly in line with what I expected. Sorry, Linda, was there something else you wanted to?
Nope,
Go ahead.
just I will
Okay,
let
very
you
good.
continue
Yeah,
on.
I see the poll in my in my dashboard here. I'll go to webinar dashboard. As I'm looking at it, I'm not surprised with these results. I, I I would hope that the 17% is going to look different after today. Um, and it's certainly not good news to see that 29%, almost one third, are saying that there isn't any crisis communication training in place. And be interesting to find out during the Q&A what the reasons for that might be. And then we can also discuss, obviously, why it's important to have potentially a larger group of managers going through such training. And again, I will definitely speak about the recurrence of training, and then also the fact that it should be scenario based. So thank you very much for participating in this first of two polls. We're going to have the other one toward the end of today's webinar. All right, let me move on to, I've already talked about it several times, a little bit ahead there, crisis communication training parameters. I've already talked about the fact that it needs to be scenario based, and let's just pull up the next slide where we discuss that very specifically. It should be conducted, in addition to the fact that it should be scenario based, should be conducted at least once a year. And there should be training not only at headquarters level. If you work for an organization that is international in terms of geographical scope, then it should have a training regimen in place, and a schedule should have been developed to make sure that there is training at the national level, meaning the countries that the company, the organization is represented in, as well as the regional and local level. And I'm going to give you a quick example here. We do a lot of work with, for instance, manufacturing companies. Why is it important to do a training at the local level? Well, easy answer. If I have let's say a chemical manufacturer, and I have a number of hazardous materials that are being stored, utilized in the production process, and so forth, at any of the manufacturing sites around the globe, then I would obviously want to have people at the local level, meaning at the site level, in a position to address the different stakeholder groups in the event of a crisis. And certainly that crisis could happen very well at this particular site. It could be an explosion, it could be a fire, it could be resulting pollution, it could mean physical harm to employees or contractors, you name it. The list is very, very long. And I'm only touching on industrial accidents right now, or natural disasters maybe also. But certainly there are HR-related crises, there are crises related to cybersecurity. I'm going to be doing a webinar tomorrow on ransomware as an FYI. So lots of different potential crises that I didn't talk about earlier. There actually was a slide, but I didn't want to touch on that too much today, and have a little more time for especially the parameters that we're talking about right now. So that would be important to remember in terms of the geographical scope and where you should have training in place. It says here at least once a year. Now, if once a year, a company that is, let's just say, multinational, doesn't have to be international around the globe. Let's just say it's a company that has 3, 4 different countries in terms of the representation, then it would be prudent to look into, is it necessary to do training at the national level in those countries? Now, if I hear that there are only sales offices with very few employees in the other countries, then that's a different story. But as soon as I hear there is manufacturing in place, or it's a larger number of employees, let's say it's a financial services company or whatever other industry, then I usually need to listen more closely, and in tandem with management, a decision is made whether it's prudent to have crisis communication training across countries. And then we obviously need to factor into the mix what are the different ways in which communication might happen with different stakeholder groups in those countries. We do want to have not an ethnocentric approach, but a polycentric approach, as in catering to how things are done in the other country, and then do training along those lines. So let's talk a little bit about scenario based. Why am I focused so much on scenario based as opposed to just having a training and maybe talk about a case study, but not really, because this is what scenario based means, not really developing a realistic scenario for the particular organization. We're talking about customization here. Customized training is all about having a scenario that's going to work for this particular organization. There are things that we do. This is on the risk management side of our practice, where we convene the senior management teams of, could be a very large company, a Fortune 500 company. And we actually have a process in place that allows the senior management teams with us as facilitators to develop what will eventually be a short list of a ranking, if you will, a couple of scenarios that we will then consider for training, for developing scenarios for crisis management plans, crisis communication plans, and so forth. Two questions real quick that go into that, and they're very important to ask, are as follows. What is the first question? What would be the most impactful in terms of a crisis event, in terms of a crisis, maybe at this particular site or at this particular country headquarters, or for the company as a whole? And that gives us a certain list of, let's say, 5, 10, however many we want to have. And then we ask the second question, well, which of these that we have listed here now that you just identified yourselves to the members of the senior management team or whatever other group of managers has come together to have this facilitated by C4CS? Second question would be, which of the ones that you ranked according to the impact and magnitude, which of those would actually be the most likely to occur? And the likelihood of occurrence then determines another ranking, which has these two questions built into it, if you will. And voila, we have something to work with as consultants in terms of identifying scenarios that we may very well want to use for, again, plan writing, all kinds of training. It's not limited to crisis communication. I mentioned tabletop crisis exercises, which we do a lot earlier. Same thing there. We do need to have something that's realistic, that allows folks who are going through this training to identify this particular problem scenario as something that could very well happen. And yes, indeed, we have done trainings, drills, tabletops, crisis communication training, where we convened management, and there were managers in those trainings who actually started to get really nervous because they thought this wasn't just a training. It was so realistic in terms of the way information was presented. Sometimes we even have a mock newscast that we put together in order to introduce the scenario and related broadcasting news pieces. Whatever you can do to make it more realistic is certainly the way to go. So that's what I wanted to say in regard to very specifically the need for having a scenario-based training in place. The reason why I wanted to make it very clear that scenario-based, do it regularly, there needs to be the recurrence at least once a year and so forth, is critical, is because a lot of times, and I think that was also reflected in the poll, where people said, yes, we do that type of training, but it's not scenario-based. That was 13%. And 42 even said, yes, we do that type of training, but it's not done regularly. And that's not good, because training in the area of crisis management, crisis communication is critical. You can have all kinds of plans written and people can actually read them, but without acting out what's in the plan and having a team work together and having coherent messages developed coming out in the form of responding to a scenario, you're never going to be fully prepared for an actual crisis occurring. That's just it. And that's not something that that is my opinion, if you will. That's something that's the reality. That's something we see in our practice on pretty much a daily basis. If you fail to do the training as it should be done, then you might be looking at the following. And this is a neat cartoon here. Okay, people, the question is, should we deny first and then delay, or delay first and then deny? And while members of the audience today, attendees, might chuckle, or at least have a smile on their face right now, this is unfortunately something that I still run into. This is the year 2021. One would have thought that we've turned the corner on such rather disappointing displays, but long ago, but it's still pretty prevalent, unfortunately, where we are being asked to come in to fix something, and there's a lot of denial going on. Ostrich tactic, put your head in the sand, it's going to blow over, we're not going to communicate, all kinds of decisions that are being made that are not conducive to surviving a crisis, and in fact, potentially even enhancing on the heels of it stakeholder trust, reputation, and the bottom line. All right, so what are the training parameters, since this is the section within my presentation that talks about those, in addition to the scenario that was already addressed and the recurrence, the necessity of having regular training, recurring training in place. Let's review here the 7 items I've listed under training parameters. First of all, what about delivery and participants? This being COVID-19, and as a company that specializes in crisis management, strategic communication, C4CS has obviously heavily been involved in working with all kinds of companies during the pandemic, getting things in order in terms of the crisis management apparatus, developing the tools that are necessary in order to weather the storm, the ongoing pandemic. As for training, it's critical that we decide, are we back to in person, or do we continue doing these trainings online? So over the last year and a half plus X, we've certainly done a ton of online stuff with clients. The fact that I'm addressing you all right now via a webinar speaks to that. So that's something that needs to be clarified. What about the delivery? Do we want to have an online session? Do we want to do this in person? That's one of the first questions that need to be addressed, and we need to remain flexible there. We've had some situations where clients wanted to have it in person. We have in-person stuff coming up next week, but we need to be flexible, because if there is the need to go online, then we need to be capable of doing so in an instant almost. And those are things that need to be addressed. I don't want to say more importantly, but certainly we do need to develop an understanding as the consultant, the facilitator, those who conduct any sessions, who is actually going to be among the participants for this kind of training. Isn't it important to understand who needs to be a member of the group of managers that's going to be trained? And then also, what's the number? We typically at C4CS like to, for instance, have in-person training limited to 8 people. We'll go over the other parameters here. I'm going to mention the item under 5 at this junction, live on-camera practices and video review. If you have a group of 20 people and you're doing an in-person training, well, how much time, let's say it's a 7-hour training plus a working lunch, which is what we do for full-day training, how much time will each and every training participant really have in front of the camera? Going through a mock interview experience, potentially having a news conference also as part of the training, mock news conference. Well, that is determined by the number of participants. By that, I mean full participants that actually will be or want to and should appear on camera, because they are designated spokespersons or have been designated to go through training in order to develop the skills to then become a spokesperson. Yeah? So as identified here under 1, the question how many people in each training, whether it's online or in person, is one that needs to be addressed. Then I would argue that it's critically important to have a pre-training participant questionnaire for any crisis communication training. Now, we do this for all kinds of trainings or crisis exercises, I find it particularly important to do it for crisis communication training because we need to understand if folks have had previous training that is comparable to what we're trying to do. Are they camera shy? Do they like to speak publicly? What have they taken away from trainings that they've been through in the past? Has there been anything that didn't work well? Has there been something that did work well? How can we emulate that in the training that's coming up? Should this be a new client? All kinds of questions that a participant questionnaire will certainly need to address. And then in addition to a questionnaire, let's say this is more of an executive coaching one-on-one situation. I do a lot of that stuff. Then it's certainly also a good idea, or replacing the questionnaire to have a conversation prior to any training. Yeah? So sometimes it's a good idea to have a video conference prior to a training and address essentially the same question, or at least a subset of those questions that are included in a questionnaire, pre-training questionnaire in a video conference or conference call. Yeah? And again, it's about assessing where are the participants right now, because that will then allow us to get them to where they need to be. If we understand where that gap is, where there are missing skills, where there is a need to bridge that gap, then we can hone in on that and do a good job in terms of putting a training together that will stick. All right, and then we have under 4 training components on, for instance, stakeholder analysis should be included. Yes, should be included in a crisis communication training. How do we figure out who our stakeholders are? And there are a couple of slides later in the deck where I will talk about this a little bit more. Message development needs to be in there, also coming up here with just a little bit of information on slides, and live on-camera practices. Video review, mentioned that earlier. Obviously, very important that you actually rerun that tape and have a video review. It's not about taping it and then not discussing the performance, right? And some people might find that less than appealing to, one, have to appear on camera, and B, to go through a critique with their colleagues present. But I can assure you that it's critical in order to make the training more effective. Then you should address in the form of slide material, discussion, what to do and what not to do during a crisis response. When it comes to communication, you could certainly also discuss templated material where you have standby statements in a crisis communication plan, and so forth. By the way, a crisis communication plan, I haven't said it before, every single organization, certainly the ones that are represented here today, but by and large, every single organization out there should have a process in place and a crisis communication plan in place. Now, if you say you are a very small organization, you have only 3 employees, you're a small business, and that's certainly a different animal. But again, by and large, if you are a little bit, if you are a company, organization that has more employees, it's a little more complex, good idea to have both in place, training as well as the plan. And then lastly, listed here under 7, training evaluation questionnaire, and there should be a debrief. And that can be done by phone, in person, online. Different options are available. So, spokesperson, I don't want to hash this out too much, but obviously we do need training. Crisis communication training is, however, much different from media or spokesperson training, because here we're applying spokesperson skills, among other skills, to a fictitious but realistic crisis scenario. Now, again, we want to have something scenario-based, and that's what makes it a crisis communication training. Spokesperson training doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a crisis. It certainly could. But when we refer to media training, spokesperson training, that is not necessarily a training that is based upon a crisis at all. In fact, most of those types of training that we do might have a particular issue or something adversarial that's going on around which we then conduct mock media interviews as part of that training. but the crisis or a crisis, realistic crisis as the core, as the centerpiece of the training, that would be a crisis communication training. All designated spokespersons must receive regular crisis communication training, and it has to be recurring. And practice makes perfect, meaning that if folks don't train and they're spokespersons, then and don't practice their craft, then the result will be a less than stellar job. That's just the reality. All right, training participants, talked about it earlier already. Who else should be on the list of folks that need to go through that sort of training? Certainly the crisis response team members, whatever terminology your organization might use there, maybe it's the crisis management team or whatever the associated acronym might be. All of those folks, including backups, auxiliary members, experts, those should all go through crisis communication training. And whether it's a half-day training, full-day training, depending on the needs, that can certainly then be discussed. Definitely also as part of the folks that should go through that kind of training, crisis communication training, senior management team, especially those who may be called upon, including the CEO, C-level people who may be called upon to address the media during a crisis response following an event or multiple events for that matter. At least 2 managers per site. I talked about the fact that there need to be local teams in place. That goes for crisis management teams as well as spokespersons at every site or company location. So if it's not a manufacturing company, but you are an energy company or whatever it may be, then sure enough, yeah, or utility, then you would want to have these teams in place at every company location. And from here, we're going to go into a sample CRT chart. We at C4CS use the term crisis response team. All of these functional areas that are represented on, and others that are represented on crisis response teams or crisis management teams, certainly then also need to go through that training. That's why it's on here. And then as we do the training, we have to obviously focus on, well, what's going to be part of the training in terms of how participants will respond to the scenario that was developed for this particular training. Again, it's about customization. The level of customization determines the likelihood of success as far as the training is concerned. And these are questions, we also have that on little wallet cards, if you will, questions that need to be answered as part of the training and working with that scenario. And that's what makes the scenario, excuse me, so valuable, because you have something that could actually happen as determined earlier. And now you have the team which will be in response mode when something actually happens. You have to go them, you have them going through these questions in order to get crisis communication on the right track, doing not only the exercise, the training, but also in reality, following the playbook as in what's written in the crisis management and crisis communication plans that you have in place. And the outcome will be a team that is going to be gelled, that's going to be in a much better position to respond to a crisis in an effective manner. Next one, key messages. This is just a little reminder for you. We use this triangle here on the right. Facts, feelings, actions is what it needs to be communicated. So preparing to say what you know, preparing to say how you feel about it, and preparing to say what you will do about it are the 3 areas that need to be tackled for any communication in times of crisis. That is very important. And messages that are being communicated must, in fact, be true. They must come from a credible spokesperson, so they must sound true to that speaker, or you're looking at a gap in terms of nonverbal and verbal, for instance. And lastly, they obviously must sound true to the audience, or it's just not going to fly. Now, if you don't come across as believable as a spokesperson, you've lost the battle right there and then, no matter what it is that you are actually having, that you're actually imparting, that you're actually saying. And effective messages are coming as a result of asking these questions. What do they think, do now? That's geared toward your audiences, your stakeholders. What do they care about? And what do you want them to do? Think and then do at the end of the day, because it's about action. You know? Remembering the triangle I just showed, we do need to talk about facts, feelings, actions. In a crisis situation, you want people to do certain things. There are employees that want to be informed, but they also want to receive guidance as to how to act in response to the crisis. Is there something that they can help with? There's tremendous allies during those times. Feed them that type of information. That's very important. It's going to be very, very helpful. All right. We have coming up next the agenda point social media component. It's already 1:46. I'm going to go through these slides before we then hopefully have a little bit of time, 10 minutes or whatever left for a Q&A. But I did want to share with you why it's so important to have a social media training component. Obviously, over the last 20 years or so by now, things have changed dramatically in terms of the influence of the internet on email before that in the 90s, and then things such as social media channels appeared on the horizon. Today, there is no company, period, that can legitimately say that it's not important to also keep an eye on social media during a crisis. We do a lot of monitoring for companies, internet and media monitoring, certainly also during a crisis, but also on a regular basis. And understanding what's going on in social media is essential in order to have a functioning response. You know? And here are just a couple of the channels listed: crisis and social media response. Why is it important? Because there's huge impact. It's an ever-growing number of social media users across different platforms. In addition to those users, traditional journalists now utilize social media and user-generated content for story ideas, fact-checking, putting their news broadcasts together, putting their articles together when we're talking about print. So not only is it the individual user that receives information through social and puts out information, which is then uncensored. We're going to talk about this in just a sec. It's also that journalists with traditional media are going to social media to mine content that is available online for their own journalistic work. So very important. I just mentioned uncensored. That's related to the fact that we do not have an editor. We do not have producers. We do not have people who have been trained in order to vet information before it gets put out via traditional media. Social media doesn't have that. It is, however, global. It's immediate, automated, syndicated, long-lasting, and therefore potentially damaging. And that's why we need to have it on our radar. Now, there are also a couple of opportunities linked to that, but by and large, the focus needs to be on preventing fallout, preventing negative scenarios unfolding. And that's why the potentially damaging area is underlined there. Very important to remember. And real quick, social media crisis response, that's something that we use at C4CS, developed for the purpose of enabling clients to understand better what this is about. I mentioned monitoring earlier, then the analysis. Are claims made in social media legitimate? Who makes them? What is it all about? Why are they making these? Then we want to prioritize and go after the ones, or concentrate on the ones that are potentially the most damaging and that are urgent in terms of our response. We need to decide, do we even respond? If so, how are we going to do that? When? Usually our recommendation is the same tool in the world of crisis communication. And then, however, we need to adjust. As we always need to do when we're responding to crises, the evaluation happens during the crisis response, not just after the fact, during the post-crisis phase. It happens as we're responding. And then we need to sometimes very, very quickly, coming out of that evaluation, adjust what it is that we're doing. And sometimes we have actually made a 180 on certain things, whether it was messaging related or not addressing a specific stakeholder group right away and then jumping on it because there was a need to do so, whatever it may have been. finally, learning, optimizing crisis response certainly also included. And that brings us to what you need before we go into the Q&A, excuse me. I wanted to summarize things a little bit. What do you need as an organization? Well, the number one thing, you do need crisis communication training. That's not listed here, but you probably knew that that was something that I would highlight under what you need in that case without actually mentioning it. But in order to make this type of training happen, you need senior management support and funding. You do need a crisis communication training schedule in order to make sure that indeed there is that recurrence. You have regularity in terms of the offer of training for the different groups of managers at, again, local, regional, national headquarters level, if you are that large an organization. You need to have experienced trainers, no brainer. Those need to come from outside of the organization. Those who are in the training room should never, ever know upfront what this crisis scenario is all about. They're walking into the training room and they get hit with a scenario that comes out of nowhere. They don't have any inkling as they enter the training room in the morning. And then we can have a session learning facilitated as part of that in real time. So online, in-person training, delivery options that was discussed earlier. Which way are we going there? If we do decide online, we obviously need to have the technology in place. We need to be able to do everything based on whatever video conference provider one might use. That also ties into the technical equipment for not only online, but how do you record when you do it in person? Well, we need to have camera equipment, audio equipment, and so forth. That all needs to be in place and set up. And then I already mentioned that several times earlier, you need to have the pre-training questionnaire. You should have post-training evaluation. You should have a debrief, potentially also conversations with folks as you're getting ready to put a training together, and then obviously also as part of the debrief following it. Bottom line, it needs to be fully customized in order to work. And the customization has to do with all of these items that we have gone through. So it's about who is going to be part of the training. It's about what type of training are we doing online or in person. It's about the schedule that we have. It's about the fact that we really should have a scenario specifically developed for this particular training because it's this particular company location, because it's this group of managers, and because this is the training scenario that will work the best for this particular setting and group of people. All right, we're coming up to, before we do the Q&A, care to share, Linda, I would ask you to do the poll here. I see that just came up. If you could please let us know that you believe that training not going to happen anytime soon, doubt it, but never know, hopefully. Share what I learned and then we'll see. And I'm interested in that last item. It's important and will be in place soon. In case it hasn't been in place, where are you on the scale here? That's what we're interested in. And I saw when the poll got started, we were looking at 100% not anytime soon. That would be very concerning. But that is changing as more people are included in the poll. We're now down to 21%, which is good for not anytime soon.
Let's give it about 10 more seconds. And if you have questions, now would be a great time to post your questions in the question pane there. And then I can share them with Oliver after we close the poll.
Absolutely.
So about 5 more
Thank
seconds.
you, Linda. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Good. So we're looking at 23% of those who were polled not anytime soon. That's roughly in line with what usually it's definitely a double digit, but I like it in the teens, not in the 20s when I make these presentations. Important and will be in place soon is on the other end of the spectrum. That's good because that's 18%. I like to see that because that means that maybe even what I just presented has made a little bit of a difference. So that'll be good to keep in mind. And then 2, 3, and 4, I'll share what I've learned from this webinar. That's much appreciated. That will help your organization. I think it's a very good idea to take, whether it's the handout or notes that you might have taken during the presentation, and share that internally and see what's going to happen on the heels of that. I can only encourage everyone to do so. And I like the fact that 23% are saying I'll discuss it and I'm optimistic. I tend to be optimistic whenever we have the opportunity to talk to senior managers or management in general. We can be pretty persuasive, and usually folks are listening. Again, this day and age, social media crises are rather prevalent, and folks are interested in showing up as far as crisis communication is concerned.
I don't see any
Any
questions
questions?
coming in, Oliver.
Yeah, that's why I kept talking. I also have that up here.
Okay.
And I will be glad to answer questions. Maybe not such a bad idea that I went a little bit longer with presenting the material. Didn't have more time for questions set aside. But the bottom line here is that we do want to, and I'm advancing to the Q&A slide here, and then we'll go one beyond. The bottom line is, it is indeed far better to prepare and prevent than to repair and repent. And the prepare here, going back to the pre-crisis phase, the crisis response phase, and the post-crisis phase, one of the earlier slides in this deck, where I had prepare italicized, because the crisis communication training, which was specifically discussed today as one of the a number of tools and things that need to be in place, that is linked to the preparation during the pre-crisis phase. It is too late if someone wants to do a crisis communication training and the house is already on fire. Believe it or not, we have received calls, not a whole lot, but there are people who think, okay, we have a crisis right now, why don't we do a training, make it go away? That's not how this works. It's about putting the necessary, and then you laugh, and it's sad actually, but it's about putting the necessary pieces into place ideally long before you have whatever crisis it is that may unfold. That is what's going to allow you to do a good job as a team upon the actual occurrence of a crisis down the road. And I'll leave it at that.
So we do have a couple of questions, Oliver. So I was going to interrupt you just before we run out of time. The first one is, what is the best way to advocate for emergency communication training? I'm just going to read you all three, just because we have 2 minutes left. So one is the best way.
I'm glad there are questions. I'm really glad there are questions. So let me address that one right away. Advocating internally can be difficult. It's something that everybody who works in crisis management as a larger discipline runs into, because nobody knows when you will actually have a crisis occurring, right? But what I typically say is the fact that a senior management team is looking at a situation where the organization has not had a crisis incident, a crisis happening in however long, and that may be years, does not mean anything in terms of the likelihood of a crisis not happening tomorrow, let's say, or in a week, or in 2 weeks, or whatever. So ideally, I like to, and I obviously do that in conversation with senior managers or management in general, I like to point out that it is important for those who run the organization to keep in mind that if a crisis were to happen, it could potentially wipe out half of the business. If it's tied to a revenue generating product, for instance, where, let's say, 30% of what the company makes on an annual basis is tied to that product, and now you have a crisis that makes it impossible for you to sell that product, or you have a cybersecurity related event while your computer system breaks down, you need to be able to respond to that, or you may just lose half of your customers right there and then. So, and I don't want to to be too much of the doomsday dude here, it is very realistic thinking about what could happen to your organization and could this happen sooner than later to say, yes, it actually could. And that should be the starting point. In addition, we're obviously available. I do a lot of talking to senior managers internationally in order to do just that, persuade them that putting these necessary steps in place is the way to do it. It's part of their fiduciary responsibility in the U.S. I mean, mention that real quick. We had Sarbanes-Oxley years ago as legislation that then changed the tide quite a bit, because starting back then, individual members of corporate boards became liable for their organization going through a crisis without having properly prepared prior to the crisis occurring, right? Now boards, the individual members of corporate boards have liability insurance and are very interested in bringing in crisis management experts such as a C4CS, and that's why I address corporate boards, why I address senior management teams, because they understand that nowadays a crisis can derail the entire business within a short amount of time, and it's extremely hard to recover. There can be lawsuits, and even if you win in the court of law, that doesn't mean that you will win in the court of public opinion. Your reputation may be tarnished for a much, much longer time. All right, thanks,
So
Linda.
we have three more questions. What's your
Yes.
take on establishing regular meetups with media practitioners before any crisis happens?
Not a bad idea. That falls into the realm of media relations, right? To have good relationships with media representatives across the board, not just limited to a particular media outlet or type of media, let's say TV or whatever. You want to build relationships as an organization with journalists, reporters over a longer period of time, as that is part of your insurance policy, that if and when something goes wrong tomorrow, you will indeed be able to fall back on those relationships. Because if the journalists believe that your organization is trustworthy, that you as one of the representatives of that company is trustworthy, then they will work much more cohesively with you and will actually accept material that you will make available. They may not haunt you as much if you're not able to provide information right away, but understand that you are, in fact, now going through the fact-finding stage and will not harass you all the time for that information. So
Yeah.
I can only encourage you to build these relationships, whatever tools you want to use there. If you want to have a get-together with journalists, if you want to invite them for an open house or whatever it may be, we do all kinds of things on the media relations and with our clients. And I definitely want to encourage people to look into the different options there and have that in their back pocket, if you will.
This next question is one that I haven't seen before, and I'm curious as to what you suggest. It says, is there a suggested lead time during a crisis before a spokesperson should show up and speak to the public? So how quickly should a spokesperson get in front of the media when there's a crisis or during that crisis?
Yeah, so thank you, Linda. Well, this is a question that's hard to answer. It's because every single crisis is unique, and there is not a blanket statement that I can justifiably present at this point. I can't. But I can say this. It is critical to be quick in terms of the communication with all kinds of stakeholders out there. And here's the reason why. If you are not ideally first to the plate in terms of communication following a crisis, following an incident of whatever type, then there is going to be what we refer to as a news vacuum. And for instance, journalists with the print media in this particular area, radio, TV, whatever, are going to go to other sources of information, including, again, social media, including neighbors of this particular company location, in order to get answers to their questions. And you lose out in terms of establishing the narrative regarding this crisis. That's why it's so important to be not first by any means, but to have the communication with reporters and other stakeholders established very early on in the process. And in order to do so, it is enough, I alluded to this earlier, initially you do not have the facts available, at least in 99 point some percent of the cases. So you go through what's called the fact-finding stage, or whatever terminology you might use. During that stage, it's critically important that you, however, communicate. And even if the only thing that you do in response to requests from reporters for information is telling them, actually reaching out to them, reaching back out to them, and over the phone, email, whatever it is. You know what, Mary, right now we're still in the fact-finding stage. I'm determined to get information to you as soon as possible. Please give me another hour or two, then I'll check back with you. And at that point, we'll hopefully have some information that we can share. If that's not the case, I will let you know, and then we're going to establish a time for maybe a news conference or whatever it's going to be down the road. But you should have that communication in place. And a reporter will be understanding. Now, if for 3 days in a row you always say we're still fact-finding and so forth, then that's not believable. But at the outset of a crisis, it is not at all a bad idea. In fact, it is recommended to establish the communication, to say that you are in the process of understanding what exactly happened, and you will get back to the journalist, and you need to do so on the heels of that promise, making that promise as soon as possible.
Yep. And then the last question is, what are the parameters whether we have to or we don't have to answer a news write-up about our organization's crisis?
Well, I would generally say that I mentioned the ostrich tactic earlier. You remember the slide? I can pull it up on another screen to repeat what it says, that cartoon. This is senior management team, crisis just had happened, and then they debate, okay, people, the question is, should we deny first and then delay, or delay first and then deny? If you follow this route, if you fail to communicate, I've already mentioned it a minute ago, there's going to be a news vacuum, an information vacuum. And if you don't fill it, then others are going to fill it. That will change the narrative in all likelihood away from what it is that you want to get across as an organization. Namely, for instance, as one of your key messages, that you take safety very seriously at company XYZ, that you are in the process of comprehensively investigating what has transpired here, and that you are determined to fix things as soon as possible. And I'm just paraphrasing here, obviously, but if you don't do that, and if you don't communicate, then you're already in the hole. Then you already are in what can be described as a defensive mode. You are reactive as opposed to proactive. And again, there is no silver bullet to all this. I'm not sitting here saying that in all crisis situations, we all need to be at the plate right away and talk to journalists and this and that. I can't make a blanket statement like that. Based on my experience, however, it is better to be quick, even though it is very, very hard during a crisis to get your hands on the information that is requested by the different stakeholders. And very important also for me to say, I'm concentrating very much on the media here with requests for information and all that. I make it very clear, and have made all kinds of presentations specifically on employee communication, including COVID-19, by the way, where I make it clear that internal communication needs to be happening at minimum at the same time as there is that same information being shared with external stakeholders. Because if you don't go that route, you will lose your own employees, which are so critical to organizational survival and doing things well as a company. If you lose them, there will be a lack of motivation. They may want to change, go to a different employer. The buy-in is gone. That's how companies are hurting themselves big time when they respond to crises and fail to understand that their communication with internal audiences, most notably their employees, has to be timely as well, as in happen at the minimum at the same time as there is communication with other stakeholders. And obviously, there are legal requirements that don't sometimes allow you to share information with employees at the same time, or whatever it may be. But by and large, that's the golden rule that I've been following for decades now, and I would encourage everyone to take that away from this presentation as well. And that's something that should be trained. It needs to be addressed during crisis communication training, where it's highlighted that employees have to be at the core of all of the thoughts that go into what are we going to do. This goes back to the questions I had earlier in the deck today, 1 through 8, important questions to ask, things that need to be determined before communicating in the crisis. That's something that I go through with clients meticulously. And I hope that these answers were hitting the
They were
mark.
great. They were great. Thank
Yeah,
you very much.
sure. Yeah,
We appreciate all your time today and your willingness to stay a little bit late to answer the questions as well. And everybody have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
yeah. Thank you very much, Linda. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I just pulled up the final slide. That has my contact information on it. If you want to look up LinkedIn profile or get in touch with me via email, phone, whatever it is, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have beyond the questions that were asked as part of the session. Again, thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
All right. Goodbye.